Thunder over Europe. The P-47 Thunderbolt story. When German laughter turned to terror. Prologue. April 8th, 1943. The day everything changed. The morning sun cast long shadows across the frost-covered runways of Debden, England, as 16 Republic P-47C Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group prepared for their first combat mission over occupied Europe. The date was April 8th, 1943, and these American pilots, most barely old enough to vote, were about to introduce the Luftwaffe to a weapon that would fundamentally alter the calculus of aerial warfare. 27,000 feet above Caen, France, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermchen couldn't suppress his smirk as he studied the ungainly silhouettes climbing laboriously toward his formation. Through the crystal-clear canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190A5, the veteran ace of Jagdgeschwader 26 watched what he considered a gift from the Allied High Command. Die Amerikaner haben Unes Fliegen Milchflaschen geschickt, he transmitted to his wingman, his laughter crackling through the radio. The Americans have sent us flying milk bottles. Below, those milk bottles struggled upward, their 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double Wasp engines straining against 7-ton airframes. To German pilots accustomed to the sleek lines of Spitfires and the nimble maneuverability of Soviet fighters, these corpulent American machines appeared almost comical. Barrel-shaped fuselages topped with greenhouse canopies, wings that seemed too small for their massive bodies, and propellers that dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. What Hermchen didn't know, what none of the German pilots circling like wolves above could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would systematically destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Within 18 months, these flying milk bottles would transform from objects of derision into instruments of terror, their 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns becoming the most feared sound in German skies. The mathematics of destruction were already loaded in those broad wings. 3,400 rounds of ammunition, a combined rate of fire exceeding 6,000 rounds per minute, enough concentrated firepower to saw a Messerschmitt in half in less than 2 seconds. This is the story of how American industrial might, wrapped in an unlikely package, turned German mockery into mortal fear. It's the story of how innovation defeated tradition, how firepower overcame finesse, and how the thunderclap of 8 heavy machine guns became the soundtrack of Allied victory. Chapter 1. Birth of a Dinosaur. The emergency that created a monster. June 1940. France was collapsing. Panzer divisions raced toward the Channel while Luftwaffe fighters swept Allied aircraft from the skies with alarming efficiency. In a small office at Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer with a thick accent and brilliant mind, received urgent specifications from the U.S. Army Air Corps. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching the Luftwaffe's best. What Kartveli designed instead was something unprecedented, a monster that would redefine what was possible in single-engine fighter design. It will be a dinosaur, Kartveli admitted to his design team during one late-night session, cigarette smoke curling around the drafting tables. But it will be a dinosaur with good proportions. The XP-47B prototype that first flew on May 6, 1941, shocked everyone who saw it. At 9,900 pounds empty, it weighed 65% more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. Test pilot Lowry Brabham, approaching the aircraft for the first time, circled it twice before asking the question on everyone's mind. This thing actually flies? Not only did it fly, it flew like nothing else at altitude. The massive turbo supercharger system, with its complex ducting running through the rear fuselage, gave the aircraft an almost pregnant appearance that would fuel endless jokes. But this system, fed by exhaust gases from the enormous radial engine, delivered sea-level performance in the stratosphere where conventional fighters gasped for air. The heart of the beast was the Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. This power plant could maintain full power at 27,000 feet, altitudes where German fighters' performance degraded dramatically. The turbo supercharger meant that while enemy pilots struggled with thin air and faltering engines, Thunderbolt pilots operated at peak performance. But the real revolution wasn't just the engine or the turbo supercharger. It was the armament. 8 guns, the mathematics of death. Previous American fighters had carried 4 or 6.50 caliber machine guns. The P-47 carried 8. Each gun was fed from an ammunition box containing 425 rounds. The total ammunition load weighed nearly 900 pounds, more than the entire weight of some pre-war fighters. The guns were mounted 4 to each wing, positioned to converge at a preset distance, typically 300 yards. At this convergence point, all 8 guns' ballistic paths intersected in a zone roughly 6 feet in diameter. Anything caught in that zone faced over 100 half-inch projectiles per second, each traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The ammunition itself represented American industrial sophistication. The standard combat load mixed armor-piercing incendiary API, armor-piercing incendiary tracer APIT, and standard ball ammunition in carefully calculated patterns. The API rounds used a delayed action fuse that ensured penetration before detonation. The incendiary compound burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite aluminum structure and fuel tanks. Unlike cannon shells, which delivered devastating individual blows but had severely limited ammunition capacity, the Thunderbolt's battery could maintain sustained fire for over 30 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat. German fighters typically carried 120 to 200 rounds for their 20mm cannon. The P-47 pilot could hold his trigger down and watch tracers pour toward the enemy for half a minute. The feeding system alone was a marvel of engineering. 8 separate ammunition boxes fed through electric boost motors designed to prevent jamming during high-G maneuvers. The guns were electrically heated to prevent freezing at altitude. Each gun had its own charging mechanism and could be individually synchronized. The convergence was adjustable from 150 to 400 yards, allowing pilots to optimize for their preferred engagement range. This wasn't just firepower. It was a philosophy, overwhelming, sustained, and impossible to ignore. Chapter 2. Baptism of Fire and Blood. The Learning Curve Written in Aluminum. Major Hubert Hub Zemke commanded the 56th Fighter Group during their training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he initially despised the aircraft assigned to his unit. Between September 1942 and January 1943, his group lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents. The P-47 was a killer, just not a German's yet. It ground-looped on landing, its massive torque snapping inexperienced pilots sideways into the grass. It torque-rolled on takeoff if you weren't aggressive with the rudder, and it dove with such enthusiasm that pilots discovered compressibility, their controls freezing as shock waves formed on the wings, the aircraft shaking violently as it approached speeds no propeller-driven fighter had reached before. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would become one of America's top aces with 27 victories, remembered his first flight. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was unbelievable. When you pushed the throttle forward, the whole world accelerated. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. But training accidents were one thing. Combat was another. The first encounters in April and May 1943 confirmed every German prejudice. The P-47s couldn't turn with the Focke-Wulf 190s. They couldn't climb with the Messerschmitt 109s at medium altitudes. They couldn't match the nimble handling that German pilots had perfected over 4 years of continuous warfare. Luftwaffe pilots quickly developed tactics to exploit these weaknesses. Attack from below, where the heavy Thunderbolt struggled. Force-turning fights where agility mattered more than firepower. Use superior climb rate to escape when things got hot. Hauptmann Joseph Pips Priller, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, reported to headquarters after his first encounter with typical Luftwaffe confidence. The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys are calling them Indianer, fat targets pretending to be warriors. The statistics seem to confirm German confidence. In their first month of operations, American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed German kills. The RAF, observing from their Spitfire squadrons, quietly suggested the Americans might want to reconsider their choice of mount. British pilots joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around the roomy cockpit. But something strange was happening in those early encounters, something German intelligence failed to notice. The indestructible machine. The P-47s that were shot down had absorbed incredible punishment before falling. One aircraft returned from a May 4th mission with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes, damage that would have disintegrated a Messerschmitt or Spitfire. The massive radial engine, lacking the vulnerable coolant systems of liquid-cooled fighters, shrugged off hits that would have stopped a Spitfire or Bf-109 cold. The armor protection was unprecedented. 3/8-inch steel plate behind the pilot, half-inch bulletproof glass windscreen, and armor deflection plates around the engine. The structural strength was equally remarkable. The wing spars could support loads of 40,000 pounds, 3 times the aircraft's loaded weight. The engine mount could withstand 12 G-forces. Control cables were doubled throughout, with automatic backup systems. And when P-47s did get their guns on target, the results were catastrophic. German pilots who survived described it as facing a wall of lead. The combined firepower created an impenetrable zone of destruction. Aircraft caught in this convergence pattern didn't just fall, they disintegrated. Wings separated from fuselages. Tail sections severed. Cockpits shredded into metal confetti. The event that would begin changing German perceptions occurred on June 26, 1943, over Évreux, France, and it involved a man who would become a legend on both sides of the conflict. Chapter 3: Johnson's Ordeal, when the indestructible met the impossible. The mission that changed everything. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron was flying tail-end Charlie, the worst position in any formation, the spot most vulnerable to attack. His formation of 48 P-47s was returning from escort duty when they were bounced by 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from 2/GG-26, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Watz Galland, younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland. The Germans executed a perfect attack, diving from the sun with overwhelming speed advantage. Johnson's Thunderbolt was caught in the crossfire of multiple attackers, taking catastrophic damage in the first seconds of combat. 21 20mm cannon shells exploded across his aircraft. The canopy shattered, filling the cockpit with a blizzard of plexiglass fragments. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into his face, momentarily blinding him. The engine cowling was torn away, exposing the massive cylinders beneath. Fire erupted behind the instrument panel, and Johnson watched flames lick around his feet. Wounded in the nose and leg by shrapnel and bullet fragments, half-blind from hydraulic fluid and blood, Johnson tried to bail out. But the canopy was jammed. A 20mm shell had exploded in the canopy track, welding it shut. He was trapped in a dying aircraft at 27,000 feet. What happened next defied every assumption about combat damage tolerance. Despite having no forward visibility through the oil-covered windscreen, a barely functioning engine that shook violently with each revolution, and controls that responded only intermittently, Johnson managed to level the aircraft and point it toward England. The P-47 continued flying, wings riddled with holes, fuselage shredded, engine streaming smoke and fire. Still it flew. Then it got worse. The German, who couldn't believe his eyes. A lone Focke-Wulf 190 flown by an unknown pilot from 2/GG-26 discovered the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the channel at less than 170 miles per hour. Historical research has never definitively identified this pilot, though several names have been proposed based on German combat reports from that day. What followed was one of the most extraordinary encounters in aerial warfare history. The German pilot positioned himself behind Johnson's P-47 and opened fire with his four 20mm cannon and two 13mm machine guns. Johnson, unable to evade, could only huddle behind his armor plate and pray. The Thunderbolt absorbed the entire cannon ammunition load, roughly 120 rounds of 20mm explosive shells. The German repositioned and fired again, this time with only his machine guns, the cannon ammunition exhausted. Still the P-47 flew. The German pilot pulled alongside, and Johnson could see his face clearly. Young, blonde, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching fear or awe. The German repositioned one final time and emptied his remaining machine gun ammunition into the Thunderbolt. Over 200 rounds of 13mm bullets tore into the already shredded airframe. Still it flew. The German pilot pulled alongside again, shook his head in apparent amazement, gave what appeared to be an informal salute, and peeled away, presumably out of ammunition and unable to comprehend what he was witnessing. Johnson's P-47 made it across the channel. It landed at Manston Airfield with its engine failing on the runway, trailing smoke and flame. When the crew chief began counting bullet and cannon holes, he stopped after reaching 200. One cannon shell had exploded inches from Johnson's head, close enough that fragments had embedded in his leather helmet. Another had detonated against the armor plate behind his seat with such force that it permanently deformed the steel, creating an indentation Johnson would feel every time he sat in a P-47 for the rest of the war. The engine had taken direct hits to multiple cylinders. The control cables were partially severed, with only a few strands of wire maintaining connection between stick and control surfaces. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone of the fuselage, were shot through. Yet the aircraft had brought him home. The shock waves. The survival of Johnson's aircraft sent shock waves through both air forces. American engineers studying the wreckage realized they had underestimated their own creation. The structural redundancy, the armor protection, the sheer mass of the airframe, all combined to create a level of survivability unprecedented in fighter design. German intelligence, receiving combat reports from the pilots of 2/JG-26, initially refused to believe it. No aircraft could absorb that much punishment. But testimony from multiple pilots confirmed the impossible. The Thunderbolt had taken everything the Luftwaffe's best fighter could deliver, over 200 hits from cannon and machine guns, and survived. Word spread through both sides. American pilots began to trust their mounts. German pilots began to fear them. The flying milk bottle was becoming something else, a fortress with wings. Chapter 4: The Tactical Revolution. Learning to fight the American way. By July 1943, American pilots were learning to exploit the P-47's true strengths. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, the 56th Fighter Group commander, had discovered the secret through brutal trial and error, written in the blood of pilots who had tried a dogfight with German fighters. His instructions to his pilots were simple and absolute. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. The Thunderbolt's massive weight, initially seen as a fatal disadvantage, became a weapon. In a dive, nothing in the German arsenal could catch it. From 30,000 feet, a P-47 could reach 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could achieve even in a vertical dive. This speed advantage could be converted to altitude in a zoom climb that left pursuing fighters helplessly behind. Their engines starved for oxygen, their pilots watching the American fighter disappear into the stratosphere. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, who had become one of the first American aces in Europe, developed what became known as the boom and zoom tactic, though pilots called it the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity. Don't fight on German terms. Create your own battlefield. Instead of engaging in traditional dogfights, P-47 formations would climb to 30,000 feet or higher, altitudes where German fighters could barely operate, where their engines coughed and sputtered, where pilots gasped behind oxygen masks. From this commanding height, the Thunderbolts would wait. When Luftwaffe fighters appear below, engaging bombers or climbing to intercept, The Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive. The acceleration was phenomenal. Within seconds, they would be traveling at speeds that made deflection, shooting impossible for defending Germans. The relative velocity was too great. The angles changed too rapidly. At the bottom of these dives, traveling at over 500 miles per hour with 30,000 feet of gravitational energy converted to kinetic power, the American heavy machine guns would speak. The wall of lead. German pilots who survived described it as facing a wall of lead. The combined firepower of a P-47 formation created a convergence pattern that was less a targeted weapon than an area denial system. You couldn't dodge it. You couldn't outrun it. You could only pray you weren't in its path. The mathematics were merciless. A single P-47, firing a 2-second burst, put 160 half-inch projectiles into a target area roughly the size of a small aircraft. A flight of 4 P-47s, all firing simultaneously, created a cone of destruction containing over 600 rounds per second. Aircraft caught in this convergence didn't just fall, they disintegrated. Wings separated from fuselages. Tail sections severed. Cockpits shredded. Engine blocks cracked. Fuel tanks exploded. Luftwaffe after-action reports from this period contain recurring phrases. Disintegrated under fire. Complete structural failure. No parachute observed. German pilots began using a new word to describe the effect of concentrated .50 caliber fire. Zerfetzt, torn to shreds. The true revelation of American firepower came during the August 17, 1943, dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the deepest penetration into Germany attempted to that date. Schweinfurt, the baptism of fire. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, encountered a formation of Messerschmitt Me-110 Zerstorer destroyer, aircraft positioning to attack B-17s with their heavy cannon and rocket armament. The twin-engine German fighters, heavily armed but less maneuverable, with a Luftwaffe's specialized bomber killers. Schilling's flight of 4 Thunderbolts rolled into their attack dive from 28,000 feet. The German pilots, focused on their bomber targets, never saw them coming until the first tracers ripped through their formation. Unteroffizier Heinrich Roth, a gunner in one of the Me-110s who survived by bailing out, later recounted in a POW interrogation what it was like to face P-47 firepower. The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven. I opened fire at 800 meters, good hits. I saw them strike the fighter's wing. The P-47 didn't even wobble. Then he fired. The aircraft ahead of us simply came apart. Not shot down, destroyed. The wings separated from the fuselage, spinning away in different directions. The tail severed cleanly, tumbling end over end. The crew compartment, where my friends were, shredded into metal confetti. In 2 seconds, and Me-110 became nothing. Just debris falling toward Earth, and 2 parachutes, if the crew were lucky. 8 Messerschmitt Me-110s were destroyed in less than 1 minute. The German pilots had never experienced such concentrated firepower. Their heavy fighters, designed to stand off and destroy bombers with rockets and cannon, proved helpless against the diving Thunderbolts. German combat reports from that day contain a recurring theme: disbelief. Pilots who had flown hundreds of missions against Spitfires and Hurricanes, who had survived the Eastern Front's brutal skies, encountered something new and terrifying. The P-47 wasn't just a different fighter. It was a different philosophy of warfare, overwhelming, unstoppable, industrial. Chapter 5: The High-Altitude Dominators. Where German fighters gasped, Thunderbolts thrived. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was discovering another horrifying reality about the P-47. Its performance actually improved with altitude, while German fighters suffered. The turbo-supercharged double Wasp engine maintained its rated power output up to 30,000 feet. At that altitude, the air pressure is less than 1/3 that at sea level. Normal engines, even with mechanical superchargers, lose tremendous power. But the P-47's turbo-supercharger, driven by exhaust gases, could compress thin air back to sea level density. German fighters, relying on single-stage or two-stage mechanical superchargers, saw their performance degrade significantly above 25,000 feet. The Focke-Wulf 190's BMW 801 engine, powerful at medium altitudes, became anemic in the stratosphere. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G's DB 605 engine fared better, but still suffered compared to the Thunderbolt. At 30,000 feet, a P-47 was faster, climbed better, and maneuvered more effectively than any German fighter. The Americans own the high ground, and in aerial warfare, the high ground is everything. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful aces with 206 victories, encountered this reality fatally on October 8, 1943. The death of an ace. Philipp was a legend in the Luftwaffe. He had flown over 500 combat missions on both the Eastern and Western fronts. He had survived countless engagements against Soviet fighters, RAF Spitfires, and American bombers. He was an experienced, capable pilot who understood air combat as well as any man alive. None of it mattered. Leading Jagdgeschwader 1 against a B-17 formation at 28,000 feet over Bremen, Philipp found his Focke-Wulf 190A-6 sluggish and unresponsive in the thin air. The BMW 801 engine, normally producing 1,700 horsepower, was gasping for oxygen nearly 6 miles above the Earth. When P-47s of the 56 Fighter Group dove on his formation from 32,000 feet, the German fighters were sitting ducks. They couldn't climb to meet the attack. They couldn't accelerate to escape. They could only turn and hope, and turning at that altitude, with engines struggling and air thin, meant bleeding energy they couldn't afford to lose. Robert Johnson, now an experienced combat pilot on his way to ace status, was flying at 31,000 feet when he spotted Philipp's distinctive Focke-Wulf with its elaborate nose art. The German ace never saw him coming. Johnson's combat report was clinical. Open fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute observed. Hans Philipp, survivor of over 500 combat missions, died in seconds under the guns of a P-47 Thunderbolt. The psychological impact. Philipp's death sent shock waves through the Luftwaffe. If one of their best, a man who had survived years of brutal combat on two fronts, who knew every trick and tactic, couldn't survive against the Thunderbolts, what chance did average pilots have? German High Command ordered an immediate investigation into the P-47's capabilities. The report delivered to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in November 1943 was sobering. Service ceiling, 42,000 feet, higher than any German fighter could reach. Dive speed, 550 plus mph, approaching the sound barrier. Armor protection, superior to all German types. Structural strength, could absorb damage that would destroy 3 conventional fighters. Firepower, sustained fire capability unprecedented in fighter aviation. Pilot training, American pilots arriving with twice the flight hours of German trainees. The conclusion was inescapable. At high altitude, the P-47 was unbeatable, and American bomber formations operated at high altitude. Göring, reading the report, reportedly shouted at his staff, "Why can't our engineers build such a fighter?" The answer was complex. Germany could build excellent fighters, but they couldn't build a fighter that combined the P-47's attributes because they lacked one crucial ingredient: unlimited industrial capacity. Chapter 6: The Paddle Blade Revolution. The evolution continues. In January 1944, a new variant of the P-47 began arriving in England that would complete the transformation from laughingstock to nightmare. The P-47D-22. The most visible change was the propeller. The new Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller featured paddle blades, 13 feet in diameter with broad chord blades that bit into the air like massive oars. Where previous Thunderbolts had used narrow, high-speed propellers optimized for level flight, the paddle blades were designed for maximum thrust at all speeds. The improvement in climb rate was immediate and dramatic. Where earlier Thunderbolts had climbed an anemic 2,200 feet per minute at sea level, slower than many German fighters, the paddle blade variants could achieve 3,000 feet per minute, matching or exceeding German fighters at most altitudes. The massive propeller also improved acceleration, allowing P-47s to build energy faster in level flight. More importantly, it changed the tactical equation. The one advantage German fighters had retained, initial climb rate, was neutralized. Hauptmann Heinrich Noker of Jagdgeschwader 11, a veteran with over 200 combat missions, encountered the new variants in February 1944 during a bomber interception near Hanover. He wrote in his combat diary, "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced a formation near Hanover, expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and climbed with us. When we tried to disengage upward, they followed us to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was caught and blown apart. Nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year." But the paddle blade propeller did more than improve performance. It changed the sound of the Thunderbolt. And in warfare, sound is psychological warfare. The thunder that gave it its name. The distinctive thundering roar created by the blade tips reaching supersonic speeds could be heard from miles away. It was unlike any sound in the sky. Not the high-pitched whine of Spitfire's Merlin engine, not the aggressive snarl of a Focke-Wulf's radial, but a deep, threatening rumble that seemed to shake the air itself. German ground troops reported being able to identify approaching P-47s by sound alone, long before they appeared in the sky. That deep rumble meant death from above, machine gun fire, bombs, rockets. Survival meant finding cover immediately. They began calling the P-47 Donnerschlag, thunderclap. The sound had a profound psychological effect. Soldiers who had fought in North Africa, Italy, and Russia, men who had endured artillery barges and tank battles, described the approaching thunder of P-47s as uniquely terrifying. It was the sound of industrial power, unstoppable and impersonal. By March 1944, P-47s equipped with external fuel tanks could escort bombers deep into Germany. The standard configuration carried two 108-gallon wing tanks or a 75-gallon belly tank, extending range to over 1,000 miles. With the paddle blade propeller providing improved performance even when loaded with external tanks, Thunderbolts could fight on equal terms immediately after dropping tanks. The Luftwaffe's response was to concentrate on the bombers, hoping to inflict enough losses to stop the American daylight campaign before Germany's industrial capacity was destroyed. But this strategy required flying through the P-47 escort screen, an increasingly suicidal proposition. The grudging respect of warriors. German pilots developed a grudging respect that bordered on fear for the big American fighters. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, one of Germany's top aces with 275 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, survived an encounter with P-47s on March 6, 1944, that left him badly wounded and his aircraft barely flyable. He later recalled in a post-war interview, "We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sun. Someone laughed and said, 'Here come the flying pigs.' Nobody was laughing 30 seconds later. They came down like an avalanche, faster than we could react. The first pass destroyed 3 of our fighters, just gone, transformed into burning debris falling toward Earth. Their guns didn't fire in bursts like ours. They poured out solid streams of fire. Getting caught in that stream meant instant death. Not a quick death, instant. One moment an aircraft existed, the next moment it was fragments. I tried to turn into one. He followed me through the turn. I couldn't believe it. These machines weren't supposed to turn. But at that altitude, at that speed, he stayed with me. Then he fired. My aircraft came apart around me. The wings, they just bent backward and separated. I bailed out, spent 3 months in hospital. The doctor said I was lucky. They were right. Most pilots who encountered P-47s didn't get to be lucky." Chapter 7, Ground Attack, the Jabos Unleashed. When escort fighters became tank killers. As P 51 Mustangs arrived in spring 1944 to take over long-range escort duties. P-47 units increasingly focused on ground attack, a role that would make them the most feared aircraft in the German arsenal. The Thunderbolt's heavy machine gun battery proved equally devastating against ground targets. The standard armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could penetrate the top armor of most German vehicles. A 2-second burst put 160 half-inch projectiles into a target area the size of a truck, more firepower than a squad of infantry could deliver in a minute. But it was the addition of bombs and rockets that transformed the P-47 into a true multi-role monster. The P-47D-25 variant could carry two 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pounder under the fuselage, a bomb load equal to early war medium bombers. Later variants added zero-length rocket stubs for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, VARs, each equivalent to a 105 mm artillery shell. The Thunderbolt became something unprecedented, a fighter that could establish air superiority, then remain over the battlefield to destroy ground targets with devastating effectiveness. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, experienced P-47 ground attacks firsthand. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces behind their goggles. The sound was terrifying, engines roaring, rockets screaming. Then the hammer of those heavy machine guns. A column of our trucks simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles transformed into burning wreckage in one pass. The drivers didn't have time to run. They were just gone. The psychological effect on the men was devastating. They called them JBOs, fighter bombers. But these were something beyond that. They were flying artillery with the accuracy of snipers. We couldn't move in daylight. We couldn't resupply. We couldn't reinforce. We could only hide and wait for darkness. D-Day, the day the Luftwaffe died. On June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe discovered how completely the balance of power had shifted. Over 500 P-47s provided air cover for the invasion, creating an impenetrable umbrella over the beaches. They were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet, covering every altitude, every approach vector, every possible route German fighters might take to reach the invasion fleet. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones were massacred. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jägerschwader II was one of only 3 German pilots to reach the beaches that day. His report was read by Hitler himself. The sky belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet. We tried to break through at dawn, 12 fighters from our group. I was the only one to return. The P-47s were waiting at every altitude. You couldn't climb over them, couldn't dive under them, couldn't outrun them. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain. I saw Hartmann's aircraft disintegrate, just explode in midair when the Americans' guns hit him. I saw Fischer's fighter lose both wings simultaneously. I saw things I cannot describe without sounding like I've lost my mind. We have lost the sky. Germany has lost the war. In the weeks following D-Day, P-47s systematically destroyed German movement in daylight. The statistics were staggering. June 1944, 9th Air Force Thunderbolt claims 651 locomotives destroyed, 3,847 trucks destroyed, 512 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed, 4,553 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. The Wehrmacht was forced to move only at night, severely hampering their ability to respond to Allied advances. German commanders began planning operations around one immutable fact: nothing moved in daylight. The Thunderbolts owned the day.